All right, this is Ricky,
And this is Brendan.
and you're listening to A Gentleman's Disagreement.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pains we share, that American ideal, friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.
All right, Brendan, it is Monday, January 29th. Um, Fresh off of the championship games in football, you catch any of the games? Were you waiting with bated breath for a T Swift sighting?
Well, there's been the rumors that have been kind of like jokingly going around media, like NFL media in the last year about how like it's all scripted and that the NFL writes the script at the beginning of the year and then they hand it out to all like the teams and everyone has to play along with this script. And it's all kind of like haha, tongue in cheek. But then you see something like this and so you're like, oh, we're gonna have the star, the biggest star in the world, Times Person of the Year. She's going to start a relationship with like at this point the marquee franchise and one of the biggest media personalities in the league, and then that team is going to overcome quote unquote adversity and now advance to the Super Bowl, the biggest sporting spectacle in the United States. Oh, now we're gonna have 2 weeks of stories about this. As I texted you last night, it was so well written script, Ricky.
Oh man, that it's like the whole thing about the whole sort of joy that I think everyone gets from sports is that you don't know the outcomes, and so when you feel like you can tell the ending before it even happens, it does grate at you a little bit. But those were two pretty good. I mean, I don't know, two pretty decent games. You had a lot of other action besides kind of like the overarching narrative, I thought.
Yeah, and speaking of like seemingly predetermined results, like you had to know that Detroit was just going to get their hearts broken in the worst fashion there.
Just watch, just waiting for it, and then that fumble, and you're like, here it goes, here it goes. But we digress. What are we talking about this week?
Ricky, we are truly really lucky this week. We're going to bring on Dr. Yi Ming from Boston College right now in a few minutes. Dr. Ming is a climate scientist. He is an engineer by trade and now has been working in the climate space. Well, Ricky, we feel truly lucky today. We're going to welcome on Dr. Yi Ming, who is a climate scientist who's currently teaching at Boston College. He is an engineer by trade, and I'm sure we'll get into his background when he joins us in a few minutes. But he's someone that's not only a leader in the climate science field, but also in bringing people together from various disciplines to more an integrated uh, space in order to try to address like real life issues that are occurring because of climate change. So I think, Ricky, you and I have been circling climate change really since we started this podcast a couple of years ago. And at the end of 2023, when we were going over our top stories of the year, one of yours was COP28 and really like climate change and how it really seemed to come to the forefront last year in ways that perhaps it hadn't in previous years. And at that point, you and I were essentially like, all right, we got to get someone on, an expert on, to really discuss what's happening in the climate change area. Talk to us about the science, the research that's currently happening. What are the policy implications for that? And I really feel like there are few people better to talk about that, or like who are positioned to talk about that, than Dr. Ming. And again, we feel incredibly lucky that he's agreed to come on and join us here. So again, thrilled that he's given us some of his time and is going to lend us his expertise. I know you are particularly excited, not just because climate change is an issue that you care about, but because of your own background studying this area.
Yeah, definitely this one topic is near and dear to my heart, and particularly how Dr. Ming is approaching it these days, in which he's teaching a couple courses. I think one of which is called Climate and Society, which is the same name as the master's that I got. Somehow it's been ten years ago now. But yeah, this intersection of climate change and how it impacts society and what society should then do about it, I think is, really something that captured my imagination when I came out of undergrad and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. This was something that felt like felt like it was an area that I could have an impact and that needed something. And though my career has kind of gone in different directions, I'm really excited today to bring it back to in large parts where it's kind of where it all started.
Yeah, again, we are really excited. And so not to wait any longer before we bring Dr. Ming on, just a quick reminder that the podcast is brought to you by the hardworking craftsmen over at Cannon Hill Woodworking. They've been building handcrafted high-end custom tables and desks in Boston since 2018. That's Cannon with two N's. You can check them out on Instagram or visit them online at www.cannonhillwood.com. Check those guys out, give them a shout, and let them know we sent you.
All right, shall we?
Let's do it. All right, we are now thrilled to welcome Dr. Yi Ming onto the program. Dr. Ming is a climate scientist who is interested in the inner workings of Earth's climate system and the downstream impacts of climate change on humans and the environment. He earned his Bachelor's of Engineering at Tsinghua University and his PhD at Princeton University. His published works center on explaining the underlying processes of weather and climate phenomena and applying the resulting understanding to practical issues of societal and policy importance. Dr. Ming's education and research background is uniquely interdisciplinary. He is an engineer by training, and he was drawn to the physical climate science and related policy issues early on in his life. He currently teaches at Boston College as part of the Earth and Environmental Sciences faculty and as part of the Schiller Institute for Integrated Science and Society, which enables him to both pursue cutting-edge research at the core of physical climate science and to foster dialogues and collaborations amongst a diverse group of people, including natural scientists, engineers, social scientists, and policy researchers. We have been wanting to talk about climate issues for a long time, and we truly don't feel like there's anybody better to have on than Dr. Ming. So, Dr. Ming, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. So I think Brennan did a great overview of kind of your published bio. I think for our audience and for us as well, we're really interested in kind of in your background, how you went from engineering into climate, and tell us a little bit about yourself and where you're from.
Yeah, sure. I came over to this country about 25 years ago, right after college, to pursue my advanced degree. So obviously, the most logical pathway forward there is to continue your undergrad major. So as Brandon mentioned, I studied chemical engineering back in college, so I continued that pathway forward. But at that point, I realized that chemical industry has been one of the biggest polluters, right? Obviously, as a young person, you want to be on the right side of the history. And so then I figured you can use the same physical and chemical principles to solving environmental issues. So in graduate school, I switched to environmental engineering. But well, at the same time, I was still doing my PhD thesis with chemical engineering faculty. So you see, that sort of evolution of your intellectual interest and your career goal has been evolving all along. So right after PhD, for my PhD, I study aerosol particles, which are a major source of air pollution. Then it turns out that aerosol particles, by scattering sunlight, can also affect climate a lot. So then I just if you have been to Princeton, I just move across Route 1 to work at this federal government laboratory by the name of Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab. So which has been the birthplace of climate modeling in many ways, sort of a center of gravity for climate research. So I ended up doing a postdoc there. Then, to make a long story short, I remained there for 19 years, essentially also my entire post-graduation career. Then I felt that over the years I learned quite a bit, especially from my senior colleagues, including Suki Manabe, the Nobel laureate in physics a few years ago, and my mentor, Dr. Ramaswamy, and Isaac Hell. So I learned quite a bit. Then I was wondering to myself whether I can use this kind of physical climate science knowledge to better help people, especially in underprivileged communities. That this opportunity at BC came along, this newly formed Schiller Institute. Essentially, the idea is to conduct research in the environment, energy, and health. So I feel that climate change can be used as an anchor point for bringing all those different ends together, all the different disciplines together. I felt that this is once in a lifetime opportunity, so I just jump on the the bandwagon, if you will, and so here we are.
Well, we're thrilled to have you here in Boston, and the Schiller Institute just sounds like such a cool idea. And I think you mentioned it in practice. This idea that climate change really affects so many parts of our life and our planet, and it's part of it's very much part of our interconnectedness as a species. And so to bring people together and not just kind of be in their own silos of how climate change affects all of these different parts, it must be really cool for you to kind of try to bring those people together, from diverse educational backgrounds and personal backgrounds, to try to put together science and policy in a way that, as you said, helps people.
Right. That's exactly on the money, so to speak. So I'm a product of a succession of pretty hardcore engineering schools. So, but deep down under, I always have this longing to sort of get to know people better, to listen to their needs and try to use my knowledge to help them in however small way I can. That's one thing. The other thing that speaks to more our educational mission at Schiller, that is by interacting with young undergrads, sort of try to equip them with the latest climate science so that when they go out there to face the real world, they can, because for good or bad, climate change is going to be a reality for their entire career and life. So I just want them to be aware of what's going on, to have the necessary tools to sort of shape up their career in a way that can be beneficial for them personally. At the same time, they can position their career in a reference frame of the common good, so that they can sort of have a fulfilling career both personally and for the society at large. I think it's sort of one of those rare win-win situations in your life. So both for research and for education, I think Schiller Institute is really, I think, one of the ideal places for both missions.
Yeah, Ricky and I both have graduate degrees from Boston College, and this seems very aligned with BC's mission is to kind of do well and do good. And I think what's really cool about you teaching undergrads is that you probably acknowledge that some of them might go on to be scientists and engineers, but the vast majority of them are going to go into business or law or policy or education or all of these other areas. But I think what you're saying is climate change is going to affect all these areas. So if we can give like these kids, these emerging young adults, a foundation in climate science and like the actual like the science and the research of it, they can go on in their individual fields and make a difference in kind of in this climate change space.
Right. For example, this big undergrad course I'm teaching. Actually, I'm about to give another lecture in 2 hours. It's called Climate Change and the Society. So most of the undergrads sitting in that class, I have 180 or so. They're mostly, I guess, finance and econ majors.
Mm-hmm.
So in that course, I talk about hurricanes, I talk about floods, droughts, etc., etc. But and also wildfires. But I'm trying to frame everything from this sort of bottom line kind of view. Insurance premium, for example, right? So if you manage a big portfolio, how would you factor in climate risks in a more systematic manner, that kind of thing? So I think they'll get their attention right away. Then you'll say, oh, to understand those financial risks, you need to understand the physical system. I think it just gives them this extra push in better understanding the physics. Everything underlines climate change instead of just jumping into the foray and without a solid physics foundation.
Right.
Obviously, I'm not going to push them to understand all the equations. That's not the purpose. But I think with that physical grounding, they're just going to do that much better than their peers.
Yeah, no, that's it's really it sounds like an awesome program and such an opportunity for the people that get to learn from you, and such a great advertisement for Boston College, actually. So you mentioned some of the weather related events, and I wanted to get into that. So in 2023, I'll start with just here in the United States. There were 28 confirmed weather climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion. These events included one drought event, 4 flooding events, 19 severe storm events, 2 tropical cyclone events, a wildfire event, and a winter storm event. Overall, these events resulted in the deaths of 492 people and obviously had significant economic effects and psychological effects on the people living in these areas and who were impacted by these events. The average from 1980 to 2023 was 8 of these events per year, and the average for the last 5 years is now up to 20 events per year. And then, so that was just for the United States, but also looking at globally, we had the hurricane in Libya, flooding in Rwanda and the Congo, cyclones in Myanmar and Malawi, earthquakes in Afghanistan, Morocco, Turkey, and Syria that between all of them killed tens of thousands of people and untold economic losses. So, Dr. Ming, how much of this is related to climate change versus that these are just kind of natural disasters that have happened throughout history? We all grew up, natural disasters happen. It seems like these were once in 100 years, once in a century, and then it was once a decade, and now it seems we have multiple of these every year. So how much can you tie these terrible big events, weather events, to climate change?
Yeah, so first of all, I have to be a little bit naysayer because you mentioned earthquakes. I can say with a straight face that earthquakes are not related to climate change.
Good to know. See, that's what I want to know. Yeah.
And sorry for putting on that more skeptical side of being a scientist. But all the other weather phenomena like floods, hurricanes, etc., etc. I mentioned them when we were talking about this undergrad course already, right? I'll just give you this perspective. It may be striking to hear first. That is, climate is, in a sense, a misnomer. So what do you mean by climate? Climate, by definition, is average weather, right? So, but at the same time, as a senior colleague of mine used to say all averages are misleading in a way, right? You can have zero point 0.5 add up to zero point 0.5 in average, or you can have 0.1 add up to zero point 0.5 as well. So truly, in a sense, what we worry about as climate scientists is, or we do active research on, is how extreme weather events may behave in a warmer climate. So, so there is a fundamental issue here about signal and noise. Signal, I mean, things being forced by greenhouse gases, by climate change, by what we do to the climate system. At the same time, the climate system is very noisy. As you alluded to, Brandon, those extreme weather events have been with us probably since start of time, right? I trust the dinosaurs saw hurricanes to some extent as well.
Right.
But the fundamental question here is whether climate change would alter the pattern of extreme events. I think research has not given us a complete answer yet. For some of the weather events like heat waves, it's relatively straightforward. A warming temperature may just elevate the severity and the duration of heat waves. Of course, that also depends on your definition of the heat wave. But if you go to something like hurricanes, people are doing a lot of active research on them. Right now, my understanding is that for very severe hurricanes, there may be some signal there, but the jury is still mostly out. That's my understanding of the literature. And then you think about floods and the droughts. There is a very solid physical argument called wet get wetter, dry get drier, based on a simple physics argument. So we do have good reasons to believe that climate change will also alter the Earth's water cycle along. But still, how this may manifest on regional scales, it's I think we're still doing active research on it. So I don't want to venture too much out there. But another point I want to make is that you're talking about the economical loss. That's very much depend on your, for example, building practices. And as society gets richer, everyone wants to get close to a beach, and they build very expensive properties along the coastal line. Then that's obviously going to increase your exposure to floods associated with hurricanes, right? Then in the long run, if you think about rising sea level compounded by stronger storms, that's a perfect recipe for disaster. So I think it's very important to recognize there is this potential risk of natural disasters associated with climate change. At the same time, you got to think about ways to minimize your exposure, at least manage your exposure to natural disasters, given what's in store for us. So I think you got to think about the entire issue in a more holistic fashion.
Yeah, I think some of what you're alluding to is this sort of the not necessarily tension, but should the focus be on adaptation or mitigation at this point? I do want to come back to that, but I think one of the things that you said, which was a very big foundation of the courses that I took when I took a similarly named course at Columbia called Climate and Society, this idea of the wetter gets wetter and the dry gets drier, in the US, we obviously, when climate change comes up, it does come up in relation to the natural disasters, which you said that even there, the link is a bit tenuous, but this idea of long-term patterns changing, having greater impacts in other parts of the world, I think is something we don't hear that much about. And I know some of your focus areas have been on sort of the changing monsoon patterns in Southeast in the southern in South Asia or the drought in the Sahel. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about both what some of those observations are in terms of how changing climate is impacting that part of the world, and also what those implications are in terms of how those people who live there are going to have to either adapt or change.
Right. Thanks, Ricky, for bringing up my past studies on monsoons. So you mentioned two regions. One is South Asia, for example, Indian subcontinent. The other one would be African continent. I published a number of papers with a former student on the Sahel droughts. So Sahel is a region just immediately south of the Sahara Desert, north of the rainforest in Central Africa. So in the case of South Asia, so our study there, the focus was on the impact of aerosols on the on South Asian monsoon. I mentioned that I study aerosols as part of my PhD thesis. So aerosols are little tiny particles associated with air pollution. There are some sort of natural sources as well, like desert dust. But here, our main focus is on man-made aerosols. So as you can picture, most of the aerosol sources are coming from the northern hemisphere because that's where people are for most part, right? So most of the continents are in the northern hemisphere. So that's where you have a lot of air pollution and aerosols. So what we study was the impacts of this asymmetrical perturbation to the climate system. The asymmetry I'm referring to here is between the two hemispheres, because you're putting all the air pollution, most of the air pollution, over northern hemisphere. So that will reduce the thermal contrast between northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. This kind of, especially during the northern hemisphere summer, when the northern hemisphere is supposed to be much warmer than the southern hemisphere. Now you're putting this aerosol layer on top of the northern hemisphere. You're reducing the thermal contrast. Turns out the thermal contrast is the fundamental driving force of the South Asian monsoon. So that will weaken the monsoon, give you somewhat drier condition. So our study suggested, this is based on observation, that during the second half of the 20th century, the monsoon rainfall over central northern India got reduced by almost 10%. That's a major perturbation, disruption to the system. So we were able to ascribe that drying to the increased air pollution level. So that's that part of the study. Then if you think of the Sahel rainfall, this sort of semi-arid area south of Sahara Desert, so we were mostly looking at the response of the monsoon to the change in the what we call a sea surface temperature. It's just how warm the oceans are, and we artificially increase the temperature of the ocean by 2 degrees and see how Sahel rainfall may respond to it. The motivation was that back in 1970s, 80s, there was a very severe drought over there. It's just called the Sahel drought, and that caused a major damages to life and property over there. And so some people argue that could be a preview of what's to come, because as you know, in the 1970s and 80s, the Earth's temperature started to take off as well. So people worry whether those regions will turn into prolonged droughts in the future with worsening warming. So that's the motivation of our study. And here, maybe I can bring in one more element. That is climate models. Climate models are computer models. You code out based on all the equations, and you put that on a big computer, supercomputer, and you solve it. And then you will see what emerges out of that computer code is something very similar to the observed climate. So that just shows you, actually, our climate system follows a bunch of physics laws. And then you can play with computer models to look at, for example, the response of your climate to different concentrations of CO2. That's essentially how we do climate projection too. It's almost like a crystal ball we look into to get some sort of information on future climate. So to a large extent, climate model simulations are the basis for United Nations climate assessment. And obviously that forms the base for policy formulation. So going back to Sahel, what we saw was that different climate models actually gave you quite different projections for that part of the world in terms of how the precipitation may change in the future. And so we were puzzled by it. If that's the case, then how can you know, right? Especially what to do if you're there. So what we found was that we were able to attribute the different model responses to certain component of the climate models, what we call cumulus parameterization. So anyway, from that kind of exercise, now we can have a better idea of what the future may bring to the Sahel. So yeah, I know it's a somewhat long answer, but
No,
just cannot resist the urge to dive into science.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the point to some degree, that the complexity in the science, and really the complexity in the overall climate system, that you can have aerosols in one part of the world driving changes in precipitation patterns in another part of the world, makes it so difficult, I think, for the public to really grasp both what is happening. And if scientists say that it's getting warmer, but then I experience a 2-week cold stretch, all of a sudden my perception of what the scientists are telling me is different, and that doesn't necessarily conflict with the science in how it tries to explain the models. But I think that's actually a great transition, because one of the big focuses of policy lately have been on this 1.5 degree limiting of global temperature rising. I wonder if you can talk through both how they arrived at that number and what that number is meant to signify.
Right. The Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degree. By the way, that 1.5 degree is relative to what we call pre-industrial level. So that's before the recent rise in CO2 concentration. So if you think about the year 2023, we're about 1.3, 1.4 higher than the pre-industrial temperature already, just for the year 2023. Obviously, Ricky, going back to your point, the different state of what we call ENSO, El Nino, Southern Oscillation, whether it's abnormally warm over East Pacific or cold. Right now, we have a very big El Nino going on, so that's contributing to this very warm 2023 as well. But the writing is on the wall. The overall trend is going up. So we may be getting to 1.5 goal very soon, I have to say, in a very set way. So going back to your question about how you would arrive at a 1.5 or 2 degree goal, I think the main thinking there is by keeping temperature within this kind of a range, the hope is that you can avoid the worst consequences of climate change. But for example, if you study finance, obviously, or just your personal finance, you understand this compound rate, right? So if you save a certain amount of dollars, if you have 3% return on your money every year, then it may not sound a lot, but if you keep on doing this for 20 years, 3% year after year, in no time your money is going to double. So it's kind of the same thing, similar thinking, not the same, but similar. For example, we have a very solid physics constraint that is, if you increase the temperature by 1 degree, you're going to increase the maximum amount of water you can hold in the volume of air by 7%. So it's almost like a compound rate within a certain range, 7%. So if you think about the risk from flooding for the same storm, in a warmer climate, say 2 degree warmer, you're going to have 14-15% of more water vapor to dump on you. So that's going to tremendously increase the risk of flooding. So it's kind of a similar thinking there. Another factor is that we have to realize the climate system is not linear. That linear meaning if you increase this by climate, the warming by 1 degree, you're going to get X, Y, Z. Then if you increase this by 2 degree, you're going to get 2X, 2Y, 2Z, just doubling it. It doesn't behave like that. Actually, that's really something that got me worried. That is, our climate system is somewhat non-linear. There are certain sort of pressure point built into the climate system. A very well-known one, if you watch the movie The Day After Tomorrow, the AMOC or Atlantic overturning circulation. So that's bringing hot water to high latitudes from the tropics. If that got shut down or got weakened a lot, North America and Europe would get a lot colder. So then another example is the permafrost, the frozen carbon stock in Siberia, high latitude. So they have been there. If the temperature got too high, they will start to bubble, release CO2. That's going to be a major kicker in terms of the carbon cycle. So by keeping temperature in a relatively narrow range, you can minimize the risk of getting to those what we call the tipping points. So I think obviously you can say what's magical about 1.5? How about 1.6? That kind of thing. I think there is also this communication perspective. You need a round number, so something people can conceptualize to sort of really as an anchor point for getting people's attention. to put a well-defined goal there, right? If you're undergrad, I was like, get an A, right? That's my goal, right? So it has that kind of sort of a psychological aspect to it as well. So I hope I gave you a rough sense of how people settle down that particular number.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, both scientifically and, like you say, kind of logically in terms of how you are putting forth that message to the general public. You mentioned the United Nations, and I want to talk about the United Nations here because for all of its flaws, I think one of the United Nations is going to be critical in addressing climate change going forward. So, COP28, COP28 was the 28th United Nations Climate Change Conference. It took place in Dubai at the beginning of December, and Ricky and I talked about it after the conference ended, and Ricky was excited in a lot of ways because the big kind of emerging thing coming out of COP28 was that oil producers in the Middle East and beyond agreed to consider paring back the use of fossil fuels, and there was a collective promise to invest in a lot more renewable energy, and everyone pledged to write new plans to cut carbon emissions more quickly. And so there was a lot of like really good news coming out of that conference. My hesitancy in terms of being as excited as Ricky was with that news was kind of exactly pointing to 2015 in Paris, and everyone agrees we're going to try to limit it to 1.5. And as you pointed out, we've already lost that goal 8 years later. So can you talk a little bit about COP28? How did you feel about the progress made? How hopeful are you that that progress is going to be achieved?
Yes. So COP20 actually is quite personal to me because I was there as part of the BC delegation. That's a nice thing about Schiller Institute. Here we organize BC response to COP28. So we went through a very rigorous process of picking our members of the delegates. So it's a mix of undergrads, graduate students, and faculty members. So I was lucky enough to be one of the faculty members. So going back to your question, Brandon, right? Climate change does not know national boundaries. If you put CO2 into the atmosphere just because of very long lifetime of CO2, it will just get homogenized with emissions from other parts of the world. And so in that sense, there's no obvious way to take ownership of your emissions. So you have to negotiate a international framework so that everyone can be on the same page. You cannot just be a free rider. So that has to be done through some international agreement or organization. So in this sense, UN plays a critical role. Well, on the other hand, it's not a national government. You cannot force people to do things by passing law or imposing taxes. So COP28 or the COP process, people oftentimes say this in private. That is essentially public shaming game. So it's like, right, you made a promise that in a year people are going to check on it and to see whether you'll follow it through. And I think going back to COP28, for the major oil producers to sign up on the final agreement or the declaration saying we're going to be transitioning away from fossil fuel, that is still a major historical step forward. And so it's now in writing, so people are going to check on you year after year. So, right, the pressure is on, no doubt about it. But it's just how to enforce this kind of commitment and how to take stock, for example, of your greenhouse gas emission year after year. So scientists are still working on it. And so I think it's going to be a long process, but all the indications are we're moving in the right direction. I would just leave it like that. And well, mentioning two other observations of COP28. The first one is the presence or the voice from the younger generation, especially the youth uh, delegates. So they're uh, we're not negotiators. I mean, for example, the BC delegation, we're not part of the national government, so we're there to observe the negotiation. So as a result, we got the chance to intermingle with youth delegates a lot. So those are high school kids, college kids from different countries. Um, went through a very competitive process. They're so enthusiastic about the climate related issue. They feel that's their future at stake. So they're fully engaged in the process. So talking to them really gave you a sense of hope. The they're doing everything they can to increase their climate literacy, while at the same time they're not going to be shy away from their opinions. They let you know, especially let the politician know that you're playing with their future and you got to do better than what they're doing, right? So that's really uh, um, putting people in power, on the spot. You got to do something. So I think the increasing involvement, increasing awareness among young people, I think that's going to be the fundamental driving force as we move forward, both in terms of the COP process and in the greater society. And the other point I want to make is that the involvement of the private industry. And you mentioned renewable energy investment, everything. It's just with changes come also a lot of opportunities.
Yeah.
So I feel that people are, companies, utility industry, they're positioning themselves for the next wave. I feel that there are so many activities there as well. So I think it's going to be a sort of multi-pronged approach. It's not just going to be national government, as important as that is. We also have the active participation of the younger generation and the private industry. I think if we keep on pushing along all the different lines, we may have a better chance of getting everything under control.
I think that's a very hopeful message, keeping in mind that some of our goals of limiting the warming may have already passed us by, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the game is over. I think that that's at least sort of some bit of hope that we can take from this. I think one of the other interesting things that you sort of preface the discussion about, carbon emissions don't recognize national borders. And in many ways, we've been getting in our own way due to specific domestic policy considerations or really, different countries trying to preserve their own economic interests, or at least short run economic interests. From a scientist perspective, so maybe trying to put, which is almost impossible to do, put some of the political considerations aside. What are some of the things that you think are, kind of either low-hanging fruit or areas that should be focused on, either that are getting some attention or, maybe not getting enough attention in this sort of broader push to decarbonize?
I think we talk about carbon emissions do not know national boundaries, right? It does not respect. What's the best way to frame it? We're talking about spatial boundary, right? It doesn't know the temporal boundary either. So by that I mean, if you think about the lifetime of CO2, that could be hundreds of years. Then you think about essentially your history lesson, right? Starting from the Industrial Revolution, you start to burn a lot of fossil fuel, but that burning was mostly done by Western countries, right? So then gradually, developing countries in more recent decades are trying to catch up because they need to increase their quality of living as well. So then the Western countries are more sort of leveling off or even dropping to some extent by switching to greener, I would say cleaner energy. For example, the switch to natural gas in this country. And then if you think about the future, we talk about Africa. One way people are saying this was that Africa in 21st century is going to be Asia in 20th century because Africa is going through this fundamental transition towards more advanced economy. So that needs a lot of energy. So what I'm trying to say is that if you just take a look at what happened in the past, there is this fundamental climate justice issue involved as well, right? So, we were talking about COP. At COP27, there was an agreement to set up a loss and the damage fund so that the developed country can pay into it to support the mitigation and adaptation effort in developing countries. So I think that's also a major step forward. So going back to your question about low-hanging fruits, I think that's where we can be more innovative. If you think about it, take the example of India. Last year, we have been working on a proposal to look at the impacts of climate change on the mental health of a rural population in low and middle income countries. It's such a vast topic, right? You may wonder, how can you get started? Actually, the idea was to look at Indian farmers. We talk about the monsoon, how important the rainfall is for local economy, especially agriculture. So what we saw was that with a more erratic monsoon pattern, that's going to increase the mental stress of farmers quite a bit, especially in developing countries. So then you think about the low-hanging fruits. They're to improve the, for example, the irrigation system there by installing a this sort of portable solar panel. People can pump water for irrigation more efficiently. Everything that will increase the crop yield a lot, and that's going to be so important for lifting millions of people, especially women and children, out of poverty, and at the same time help them to become more climate resilient to erratic weather patterns. I think you don't need a lot of investment. At the same time, you're changing someone's life almost completely, just to give it how little people have there. I think, to me, it's not a right in this country. It's like almost like whether you should switch to EV or not, right? That's the question you're debating, whether you want to help with climate. But in developing countries, they don't have a lot, and while at the same time they bear the brunt of the negative consequences of climate change. And by going out there, especially by reaching out to the global south, I feel that the same investment can do a lot more good there. So it's as you can see, I'm not just thinking about mitigation, how to cut emissions, because if you're a climate scientist, you know a lot of warming is already in the pipeline. For a long time, this warming, even if we stop emitting CO2 right now, the warming is going to continue for some time to come. So to help developing countries, global south, to better be prepared for what's in store. And I feel that's where the some of the low hanging fruits are.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful to keep in mind. And I mean, it is one of those things that now fossil fuels are, the enemy in so many ways. But in the mid 1800s with industrialization, there was, a huge economic benefit, obviously mostly realized in Western Europe and the United States, but the ability to support really the modern day economy is built on fossil fuels, and so there is this idea, as you were mentioning, that both what's happening in Asia, in China, and in India, that really their per capita emissions, we need to still see those rise, and then obviously with Africa, it has to rise probably tenfold before this, a basic standard of living can be achieved. I wonder, the tension has always been in the United States. How can we see our resources go elsewhere? Obviously, there's this sort of historical climate debt that we kind of owe to the rest of the world, but that doesn't necessarily move minds domestically. How do you think about sort of the pitch to countries that have already kind of achieved the standard of living, that it's in sort of the overall interest to maybe allow certain countries to emit more, to raise their standard of living? But yeah, I guess how do you think about that? And obviously now we're delving out of the world of science a bit, but certainly you've contemplated these questions probably way more deeply than we have.
Yeah, we're all learning. I think almost by the day. I mentioned the loss and the damage fund being formalized as we speak. I think a lot of Western countries are paying into it. If you follow COP28, almost on day one, there was just a big announcement of big donor countries contributing to the fund. That's such a major step forward. I think people are now talking about formal mechanisms, for example, through the World Bank, how to dispense the fund to make the most out of it. I think that's a major mechanism. I think another way, especially climate scientists can help with, is by better dissemination of climate information. I just give you a quick example. For example, the climate models we mentioned about this sort of a tool you use for projecting future climate extreme events, etc., etc. That requires a lot of funding, a lot of computing power. That's not something every country can afford. If we can pull the resources together, better, informing developing countries on the latest climate information, actionable climate information for their mitigation and adaptation efforts. I think that will be another very effective way to sort of level the playground. And then obviously you have this very thorny issue. How we have this maximum amount of allowed emissions for certain climate goal. How would you sort of distribute that quota among different countries? I think it's such a loaded question. So I don't really have a good answer for that, but I think one way to think about this is that don't think of this as merely a zero-sum game. I feel that with rapid advancement in technology, and also with better understanding of the policy related to the I think and also we I one way to think about this to me is that's always I tend to be more optimistic about things even when it's very dark. I just gave you this example about air pollution. And I think there are so many areas in our policy arena. They are what we call co-benefits. For example, if you cut down fossil fuel consumption by switching from, say, a coal-fired power plant to a gas-fired power plant, you're going to cut down the air pollution a lot. At the end of the day, fossil fuels are not just a polluter for the climate. They're also just a conventional polluter in terms of producing air pollution, particles, ozone, etc. So if you identify those areas of co-benefit, I think the resistance to any movement in those departments is going to be lessened a lot. So I think we just have to be more creative in thinking about ways to deal with climate change in a more holistic fashion, sort of think outside of the box kind of view. And I feel that's an idea that has not caught up with the community at large. I think we need to put more emphasis on those sort of areas of common pathway forward instead of focusing on just the differences. Because at the end of the day, we only have one planet and we only have one home. And it's in everyone's best interest to do the best, especially for the younger generation. As I mentioned, as hard as it may be, I'm trying to be optimistic about everything. I just feel that you need hope to carry on. You need hope to do better.
That was really well said, and I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Dr. Ming, we love optimism on this program paired with like reality, and I think you did a really nice job of painting a realistic picture for us, but also giving us a lot of reasons to be hopeful. And I personally, I don't speak for everybody, but feel very energized coming out of this of like, all right, it's not as dour a future as perhaps some people, a bleak future people want to paint it as, but Dr. Ming, I feel like we could talk to you for hours about this stuff. There's so many questions. And this is what you do for a living. So you do talk to hours, but you've been incredibly generous with your time and your expertise. We greatly appreciate you coming on. I am truly jealous of all the students that get to learn from you and listen to you. And we'll certainly be keeping an eye on the work that you do personally and the Schiller Institute at BC does. But again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Yes, thank you so much, Brandon and Ricky, for having me. You guys are doing a tremendous job in public outreach, everything. So I really appreciate it.
Right.
Yeah, we hope so.
You.
So no, we appreciate you. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, have a great day, Dr. Ming.
You too. Bye bye.
Thanks. Truly, I feel like we could have spent at least another hour, if not several more hours, with Dr. Ming. And he was not only very generous with his time today, but said that he would be commendable to coming on in the future, which is always like a be careful what you wish for, because we'll have you back next week if you want. But he's got plenty of things that he's actually working on. But Ricky, I tremendously enjoyed the conversation, but just watching you listen to Dr. Ming, and obviously you have a background in this and you do a lot of work in this space, and just like the nerd aspect. I feel like so many times in these episodes it's me nerding out, but I feel like this was truly you nerding out in terms of like your thought process. So I'm curious, your main takeaways from Dr. Ming.
Oh man, I mean, kudos to you for finding him and his work and bringing him onto the podcast. I mean, you are our talent booker and you do a phenomenal job. But this one was really one for me. Uh, I think it's just such a pleasure and a privilege to hear somebody who thinks not only about their specific space, but how that kind of interplays with like everything that's going on. And climate change is really just like that particular subject that is so cross-cutting. I mean, you heard from Dr. Ming that he was started out as an engineer and then wanted to sort of do something that he felt was doing more good. But in sort of exploring this different avenue was like, well, my engineering background completely applies. And I think, for me, my background in economics, not at his level. I was an undergrad econ guy, but still, I found so many avenues that like it really applies to this conversation because there is the scientific angle, but there is also kind of this, well, what do we do about it? And that's the economics and political angle. And what's going to happen regardless of whether we do anything about it. And that's sort of the social policy and kind of all these different things. I'm really is like what got me interested in climate change in the first place. But to hear someone talk about it with both, that understanding of how different kind of laws of thermodynamics like apply to climate change and how we see it play out in reality, but then also kind of, in at this stage in his career, trying to connect the dots and help students connect the dots with, what he was talking about in terms of, if you're interested in finance and kind of risk evaluation, climate change matters to you, and here's why. I'm really excited by the work that they're doing, and it was just a pleasure for me to get to hear all that. I hope everyone who listened, learned something. I certainly did, but also kind of found, starts to think about how what I'm doing applies here.
Yeah, when he's saying that he's an optimist, it didn't feel like false optimism. And I think it goes to a lot of what you were just touching on, this idea of the younger generation coming up and in all of their fields. And I still think we're in some ways part of the younger generation. And like in all our friends, we are aware that it touches everything. And I know that globalism is like not hot in the streets right now at the the nation state level, but this is truly one of those global issues. It's inescapable, like that we are all, as Dr. Ming said so beautifully at the end of that conversation, that we only have one planet, and we like this is like we're all part of this species that are affected by our climate, and that's where it feels like there is hope. And so often it seems like we can't find these areas that we can agree, but this does seem like an area where younger people coming up do all kind of recognize that this is an issue. And that brings me to like this, one of my other takeaways from the conversation was, okay, I feel like when we were growing up, as so often happens, the extremes dominated the conversation. Either we were going to be extinct in like 100 years because climate change was going to wipe us all out, or climate change didn't exist at all. Nope, I don't believe it. Head in the sand, nothing's changing. And like I feel like that was the debate that was happening when we were growing up, like in the early 2000s. And while certainly those extremes still exist in this space, I feel like the conversation has shifted a lot more to what Dr. Ming is talking about, is that the vast majority of people recognize that climate change exists. Now it's really a question of what do we do about it? And I don't want to skip over that. That's a massive improvement just in the last like decade or so that we've kind of reached this place. And again, I think that goes back to his point that this isn't some false optimism. Like there are real reasons despite how concerning all of these issues are, to have optimism going forward.
Yeah. Uh, I mean, unfortunately, we still have those debates inside Congress for some reason, but I
Yeah.
think in general, there is right, exactly what you said. This a broader acceptance that climate change is occurring, that our current behavior is contributing to it. But then the question is, all right, so now what? And obviously, trying not to I don't think, Dr. Ming was doing a really good job in sort of sticking to the science, but there are a lot of these sort of political questions around it, right? Like if you're a person who really believes that we need to cut emissions and we need to cut them fast, do you really think that we need to be focusing all of our dollars into, like he was saying, electric vehicle conversion when if we made some investments in China and India, we could probably save all of the emissions that we're going to save by transitioning to electric vehicles and then some for the same amount of money or less, right? But okay, all of a sudden that doesn't benefit anybody in the United States, or at least doesn't provide any immediate benefit. And so there is this tension that we can continually have to grapple with. But I think some of what you were saying about the COP 28 giving you some hope that there is this like a little bit of momentum, let's say, to tackle some of these things.
Sure. And one more source for optimism that I found in thinking about preparing for this conversation with Dr. Ming was, Ricky, when we were growing up, the big issue in like climate change and climate science for us was the ozone layer. The ozone layer, we had this huge hole in the ozone, and we were concerned about like what it was doing to our climate. And there was the historic Montreal Protocol from 1987, which was an agreement to phase out the production and use of ozone depleting substances. And what have we seen? The ozone layer has improved over these last 30 plus years. And while there's still like a hole that emerges periodically over Antarctica, it has gotten a lot better. And this is one of those things, it's a process. And that's what I do appreciate, like having talked to scientists these last couple of episodes of like, let's study, let's get all the data, do the research, and then over time, like we can make policy changes to match what we're seeing as scientists. And that's one of those things where that seemed almost like cataclysmic. Like we have a hole in our ozone, like that. This is not good. But we recognize it. We agreed on some policies, and over the course of decades, things have improved. And again, that gives me hope where we're on that, hopefully on a similar path to we recognize there is an issue. We're starting to put in policies to address that issue. And who knows, in 30, 50, 100 years, we can say it's still an issue that we're talking about and dealing with, but the worst effects have been mitigated and improved in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah. The Montreal Protocols, it's like a page right out of my first day textbook at when I was at Columbia, because it is something that everyone was pointing to, like, look, we did this before, we could do this again.
Yeah.
And then, a lot of people would say, well, that was kind of a specific issue we had with these like one refrigerants that we then had a readily available replacement for. And so it was kind of easy to just phase it out. But I think that speaks to both like the solutions exist and then also like how much more complex this problem is than that one was. But I think, like you said, it all, like, the framework exists. We know how we can do this, and so people should be hopeful. And I mean, and it's like, you kind of were saying, like, we only have one planet. And so regardless of whether we're at 2 degrees or not, there's going to be some level of adaptation that we have to do. But hopefully that also means that we'll move towards protecting it and protecting it better for the future. So perhaps we leave it there.
Love ending on a high note.
All right, buddy. Good talking to you, as always. Till next time.
See ya.
What I wouldn't give for the hope I used to find in a case of lion's head. Folks of different minds, because even though it did not share the pain as we share that American ideal. Friends made over arguments in an early morning buzz. Need an early morning buzz.